like to see that this model seems great. The issue is, can you clone Oscar? Can you clone Jim for Bergen County? I really, that's questionable, and we'd like to see that, which goes to the second half of what I want. And they're doing this now. One thing I've seen in reentry, possibly the biggest marker of whether you're going to make it, in my opinion, I can't prove this, but is from what I've seen, is motivation. You're going to get knocked down, and not once. And you're going to get knocked down multiple times. And the people who make it can get up over and over again. And the problem is when you try and look at what's working, and when I was in East Harlem, we had people come in. Some people never make it to your door. Those are the people who are, they're most likely going back to prison. But then there are people who make it to your door, come in one day, don't make it to enrollment, and you never measure them. And so when you measure how the people are doing, you've creamed off some of the people who are most likely to go back to prison. It's very difficult when you do that type of measurement to figure out what's working. And what they're doing, the federal government is doing with the community reintegration program, they're doing and this is nothing new, but this is the minority of research, is they randomly assign people. Half the people get into the program who qualify, half the people randomly don't, and they compare it. And it's difficult, and you see there are some programs that work when you do it this way and really see what's working. Most don't. And it's key. Most of the things I do at work, I try things in our program, don't work. If I can't really evaluate well what's working, you're never going to get there. And my vision for Jersey and the country is when we start saying, okay, we'll look at ourselves clearly and see, maybe we fail. I hope Jersey City model, I think it's got a great start, and it's going to be a while till we build it up, but I want us to look and say, if it doesn't work, we got to fix it. If we see in a year and a half that people aren't staying out of prison because of our program, I want us to be honest with that. I don't want to be giving a vaccine to people and saying it works and it doesn't, and they're going back to jail, and I have this rotten vaccine. I don't think it is. I think we have great promise, but I want us to really be honest and say, if it doesn't work, let's figure out how to fix it, as opposed to give us money, we know what's working.
Thank you. In a perfect world of reentry, a piece of legislation that's been sponsored by Assemblywoman Bonnie Watson Coleman and myself, a piece of legislation called the Opportunity to Compete Bill, would be enforced. This is a piece of legislation that gives people who come out of incarceration a real opportunity to find a job. When people come out of incarceration now, they apply for a job. On an application form, there's this little box that says, have you ever had a criminal record? Have you ever been incarcerated? They check that box because we all know that if you work with people who have come out of incarceration, the first thing you tell them is what? To be honest. Don't lie. If you're asked, tell the truth. So they check this little box, and when they do, they never hear from that prospective employer again. With this legislation that we are proposing, that box will not be on an application form any place in the state of New Jersey. With this piece of legislation, when you are called in for an interview, you are called in because of your qualifications. You're giving an opportunity in an interview to tell the prospective employer what you've been doing since you've come out of incarceration. You can tell them, I've reunited with my family. I'm no longer on drug use. I'm a church, I go to my church, a church. I'm a member of a church or a synagogue or some other religious organization. I'm thirsty for a job. I want, as Jason Williams said, to make my children proud of me. At that point, the person interviewing you has an opportunity to see you as a human being. With this legislation, they cannot or will not ask you about your criminal background until when they're ready to offer you a job. And they're ready to offer you a job on the basis of who you are now. Not who you were before, but who you are now. And in a perfect world of reentry, that is how people who have made a mistake in their lives will have an opportunity for a job. And I know the facts have shown us around the country with other states that have had this kind of legislation that the people they've brought in who have had past histories are the best employees that some businesses have ever had. The very, very best. This works so well that, what's Target? Horizon. They're all taking that question off of their applications, and they're seeing people not for who they were, but for who they are now. That would be a perfect re-entry state.
Great, thank you very much. Let me ask Cornell, because I know you've organizations to speak, and then I'll come to David.
Sure. Well, I just want to underscore how important this legislation is, supported by Assemblywoman Bonnie Watson Coleman and Senator Cunningham. This is critical, and it is critical for these reasons. Not only does the Opportunity to Compete Act allow people to compete viably for jobs, but it also opens the door for us to look at the number of jobs for which people are eligible to even apply. So if we know that the American Bar Association says that there are 38,000 collateral sanctions or laws that keep people, once they've paid their debt to society, it keeps them out of housing, out of employment. Passing this legislation will represent a sea change. It will change the way business looks at individuals. In other words, if we understand work to be not merely economic activity, but also a moral exercise. That is to say, an affirmation of a person's dignity, their self-worth, who they are as a provider, as an exemplar for their children. That changes the way we look at people. But we have to not only make it fair for people to compete for jobs, we've got to expand the pool of jobs for which they can compete. It makes no sense, it is economically irrational for a person to not be able to drive a cab or to cut hair as a consequence of having served prison for particularly a nonviolent or long ago offense. We've got to change that. This legislation is key to that. If we can make the case in New Jersey that it makes good business sense, 1 out of every 4 adults having a criminal record, 65 million, 1 out of every 3 young people being arrested by the age of 23. Once we make it clear that this whole issue of criminal records and prison reentry cannot be balkanized or segregated analytically, demographically to an African American community or a Hispanic community, it is a statewide, community-wide, corner to corner, county to county challenge. And as such, it has to be addressed as a fundamental business and moral problem. This legislation sets us up to do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I've had a dream for New Jersey ever since Governor Cahill, remember him, put me on a task force that accomplished nothing. My dream then was to close Trenton Prison, an ugly, useless, soul-destroying Bastille. All you have to do is walk through it. How do you do that? You have to neutralize the opposition. There must be equivalents of Louis Mumford and Jane Jacobs, who are urban planners, on how to neutralize opposition to in a program like that. The money that you would save from closing the useless and life-destroying Trenton Prison, take those funds for job training for the people whose jobs would be at stake, go into communities like Camden, Patterson, Newark, that need rebuilding, restructuring, and programming that would lessen the possibilities of people going into institutions like Trenton, so that some of the money is going into the community, not into the criminal justice system. Certainly, has anybody here gone through Trenton? It's pretty, isn't it? I've been all over the country. I've seen few institutions as ugly and as soul-destroying as Trenton Prison. There's no reason why any civilized society should allow it to be sustained. But there are people who would fight because they have jobs that go with it. So when you're doing criminal justice planning, whatever state that it's in, you have to include the people whose jobs would be lost, put some of the money that you would save from closing the prison to train them and to go into the communities that might lessen the possibility of people going into those institutions.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask Tom to comment on this question. So the challenge this panel was asked to think about is turning New Jersey into a green place for reentry. And
I think,
thinking from the federal prosecution side, what are some of the things you think?
well, we actually have a fairly limited impact. The state incarcerates many more people than we do, state and local. But I think the key thing is, at the top, the president, the attorney general have signaled a shift to reducing our prison population. And the key to me is to not allow that money that's saved to be sucked into other things. So what has to happen is the money has to follow the policy. And right now, we put together our reentry court with virtually no funds. We have a little bit of money from the judicial fund, but we got no additional funding either in our office or probation to set this court up. And that's fine for us, but as we try to replicate these efforts around the country, not everyone's going to have the funding, the ability to raise funding that Governor McGreevey has. And so one of the things we have to do is be honest that we have to shift that funding now into reentry programs. Because when you have somebody that gets out and they don't have housing, they don't have even temporary housing, they don't have money for a bus pass, how are they possibly going to survive? And yet that funding is not there, at least on the federal side it's not. So I think we have to start really before they go into custody, that even we have a program in the federal system called pre-entry. When they're arrested, you start working to maintain family relationships at that stage, because being able to maintain your family relationships is key throughout the process. So to me, one of the questions I got asked from the probation office when I said, let's get involved in this, is they said, well, why are you involved in this? You're a prosecutor, what's your involvement? But our office is about public safety. That's ultimately, if we can prevent a crime, I'd rather prevent it than prosecute it. If we can keep somebody from reoffending, that's a total victory for me. So if you step back and take a different view of what your role is, I think that has to happen across the board. The last thing I'll say is, I was there, unfortunately, back in the early 80s when we put mandatory sentencing in and we put sentencing guidelines, some of which made the system